My name is Beatrice Hale, and I'm 46 years old. That's how old I was when my mother-in-law stood in a crowded living room at a family gathering, tapped her wine glass with a spoon, and announced my miscarriage to 30 relatives, smiling like it was her news to share. I stood there holding a plate of untouched food, watching her perform grief that wasn't hers, sharing pain she had no right to expose. The room went silent. Everyone turned to stare at me with expressions ranging from shock to pity to awkward discomfort. I didn't cry. I didn't interrupt. I didn't run from the room. I just watched and understood exactly what had just happened. My mother-in-law, Constance Hale, had weaponized the most private loss of my life. And as I stood there feeling my face burn with humiliation, I realized something else. I hadn't even told her about the miscarriage. Someone else had. Which meant she'd been discussing my medical history behind my back before deciding to make it public entertainment. Thank you for listening to my story. I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell so you never miss the next one. Every share helps these stories reach someone who needs to hear them. Let's keep the conversation going. I was standing near the dining table at my sister-in-law's house when Constance tapped her glass. The chatter died down as everyone turned toward her. She had that look she always wore when preparing to hold court, chin lifted, smile perfectly practiced, eyes scanning the room to ensure maximum attention. I have something to share, she began, her voice carrying that false warmth she used for performances. Some of you may have noticed Beatrice has been distant lately. I want everyone to know it's because she recently experienced a miscarriage. The words landed like stones. My stomach dropped. Several people gasped. My sister-in-law's hand flew to her mouth. Constance continued, "As a family, we need to support her through this difficult time. I know how hard it must be at her age." She looked directly at me with practiced sympathy. I stood frozen, my hands gripping my plate so tightly I thought it might shatter. The room erupted in awkward movement. Some people approached me with fumbling condolences. Others backed away, clearly uncomfortable. My mother-in-law swept toward me with open arms, pulling me into a hug I didn't want. "I'm so sorry, dear," she whispered loud enough for others to hear. "I thought it was important for family to know, so we can all help you heal." I stood rigid in her embrace, unable to form words. When she finally released me, I looked around for my husband, Thomas. He stood near the kitchen doorway, face pale, eyes on the floor. He hadn't moved to defend me. Hadn't stopped his mother. Hadn't said a single word. The gathering ended early, people making excuses to leave. As I gathered my coat, Thomas finally approached. "She didn't mean it that way," he said quietly. Something inside me fractured, clean and quiet. I realized then that this wasn't an accident. Constance had calculated this moment perfectly. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake replaying years of small humiliations I dismissed as personality clashes or harmless comments. The remarks about my age when Thomas and I married, I was 38, he was 42. "At least you won't have to worry about raising children for too long," she'd said at our wedding reception. The comments about my body. "You're looking fuller lately." "That's good." Thomas always liked curvy women. The suggestions that I wasn't cultured enough, educated enough, accomplished enough for her son. Each incident alone seemed petty to complain about. But together, they formed a pattern. The miscarriage announcement wasn't a slip or a mistake. It was her biggest move yet, a public humiliation designed to remind me of my place. I was the woman who'd married her precious son too late in life, failed to give her grandchildren, and now couldn't even carry a pregnancy. She'd taken my most private pain and turned it into evidence of my inadequacy. Constance called me the next afternoon. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Beatrice, I hope you're feeling better today," she said brightly, as if we'd had a pleasant visit. "I wanted to check in after yesterday." I waited, saying nothing. She continued, "I know you might feel embarrassed, but families shouldn't have secrets. Grief shared is grief lessened, as they say." Then her tone shifted, becoming softer, more pointed. "Of course, these things happen for a reason. The stress you've been under at work, your age, your general health habits, the body knows when conditions aren't ideal." She was blaming me. Carefully, subtly, but unmistakably. My hands shook as I gripped the phone. I have to go, I managed. After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table and made a decision. I wouldn't confront her. Not yet. But I started documenting everything. Every conversation, every text message, every interaction. I began writing down dates and details I could remember from years past. Over the next few days, I learned more about Constance's position in the family and community. She served on 3 church committees, chaired 2 charity boards, and hosted every major family gathering. People called her the matriarch with a mix of respect and resignation. No one challenged her. When she spoke, others listened. When she made decisions, they were followed. I asked Thomas about it once, early in our marriage. That's just how Mom is, he'd said. It's easier to go along than fight her. That acceptance, that unwillingness to push back, had created her power. She'd built a shield of respectability and authority that made questioning her seem petty or disrespectful. But as I researched her various positions and memberships, I realized something important. That shield was also a weakness. Her reputation depended on perception. If that perception changed, everything would shift. The grief hit me in waves. Some days I functioned normally, going through motions at my job as a graphic designer, making dinner, pretending everything was fine. Other days I could barely get out of bed. What made it worse was the isolation. Thomas avoided discussing the miscarriage entirely. When I tried to talk about it, he'd change the subject or say we should focus on moving forward. His mother called regularly with updates about family gossip, never acknowledging what she'd done. I considered leaving, packing my things, filing for divorce, starting over somewhere Constance's voice couldn't reach me. But something stopped me. Running felt like letting her win, like confirming her narrative that I was too weak, too broken, too inadequate. Instead, I decided to stay silent and observe. I attended family functions when required, smiled politely, and took careful notes on everything I saw and heard. At a family brunch 3 weeks after the announcement, I watched Constance hold court at the head of the table. She was discussing a charity fundraiser when the conversation somehow turned to pregnancy and childbirth. You know, she said, buttering a croissant, I told people about Beatrice's situation early so they wouldn't get their hopes up. False hope is crueler than honest disappointment. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably. My sister-in-law, Natalie, frowned. Thomas's cousin, James, looked at his plate. Constance didn't seem to notice. She continued, at Beatrice's age, the chances were always slim. It's biology, not judgment. I sipped my coffee and said nothing. But I saw it, the small flickers of doubt crossing people's faces. They'd accepted her version of events without question before. Now, hearing her speak so casually about my private loss, some of them were starting to wonder. The shift was subtle, barely noticeable. But it was there. After the brunch, Natalie pulled me aside in the driveway. She was Thomas's younger sister, someone I'd always liked but never felt close to. Can we talk? She asked quietly. We sat in her car with the windows up. She gripped the steering wheel, not looking at me. Constance did this to me too, she said finally. When I had my first miscarriage, she told everyone at my baby shower, for my second pregnancy. She announced that I'd failed once but hopefully won't fail again. She made it sound like concern, but it wasn't. Natalie's eyes filled with tears. I never told anyone how much that hurt. I just let it go because that's what we do in this family. But watching her do it to you, so publicly, I realized I can't stay quiet anymore. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. I have proof, she said. If you want it. Natalie showed me screenshots of old emails and text messages. Group chats where Constance had shared private medical information about family members without their knowledge or consent. Notes from doctors that she'd somehow obtained and then twisted to fit her narratives. A pattern emerged across years and multiple people. Constance didn't just cross boundaries. She systematically violated them and then framed her violations as care or concern. She does this to control people, Natalie explained. She finds your most vulnerable moment and makes it public, so you're too embarrassed to fight back. Then she positions herself as the supportive mother figure, which gives her more power. I photographed everything Natalie showed me, my hands trembling. This went beyond me. This was systemic, calculated manipulation that had been happening for years. I wasn't the first victim. I was just the most recent. And suddenly, I wasn't alone anymore. 2 weeks later, Constance announced a family healing dinner at her house. She sent a group email describing it as an opportunity to come together in love and support and to move past recent tensions. The message didn't mention me by name, but everyone knew I was the implied subject. Thomas encouraged me to attend. It's her way of making peace, he said. She wants to help. I knew better. This was her stage, her audience, her opportunity to cement the narrative that she was the gracious matriarch extending forgiveness to her difficult daughter-in-law. She expected me to be grateful, to perform the role of the humbled woman accepting her generous support. I emailed back accepting the invitation. Then I spent the next week preparing carefully, reviewing every piece of documentation I'd gathered, planning exactly what I needed to say. Constance had no idea what was coming. Before the dinner, I made one request. I emailed Constance directly. I appreciate the invitation. I'd like the opportunity to speak to the family about how I've been processing everything. I'd appreciate 5 uninterrupted minutes to share my perspective. She responded within an hour. Of course, dear. We all want to hear from you. Take all the time you need. I could practically hear the confidence in her typed words. She thought she controlled the room, the narrative, the outcome. She'd granted me permission to speak because she assumed I'd use it to thank her, to apologize for being distant, to reinforce her position as the wise elder guiding the troubled younger generation. She had no idea what I'd actually prepared. The night before the dinner, I rehearsed my words until they were smooth and calm. No anger, no accusations, no drama. Just facts, delivered clearly. Thomas asked what I was planning to say. The truth, I told him. He looked worried but didn't ask for details. The dinner was held in Constance's formal dining room, 23 family members seated around her extended table. She'd prepared an elaborate meal and decorated with fresh flowers. Before we ate, she stood and tapped her glass. The room fell silent. Thank you all for coming, she began, her voice thick with emotion. These past few weeks have been difficult for our family. Watching my son suffer as he supports his wife through such a painful loss has broken my heart. She dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. Several people looked moved. She continued for 5 minutes, describing her own pain, her worry for Thomas, her prayers for healing. She made herself the secondary victim, someone suffering alongside us but staying strong for everyone else. The room softened toward her. She was performing brilliantly. Finally, she turned to me with open arms. Beatrice, I know you wanted to share your feelings. Please, tell us what's in your heart. I stood slowly, keeping my hands relaxed at my sides. Every eye turned toward me. I took a breath and began speaking in a calm, steady voice. Thank you for listening. I want to start by explaining how I learned that Constance knew about my miscarriage. I described the exact sequence of events, how I'd told only Thomas and my doctor, how I'd specifically asked Thomas not to share the information with anyone until I was ready, how I discovered later that he'd told his mother in what he thought was confidence. I explained how Constance had then shared that information with multiple family members before announcing it publicly at the gathering. No raised voice. No accusations of malice. Just facts, delivered chronologically and clearly. I watched faces begin to shift. Surprise, discomfort, dawning realization. Constance's smile flickered slightly. She hadn't expected me to be this composed, this specific. I continued, still calm. I want everyone to understand the timeline clearly because it matters. I pulled out my phone and began reading directly from screenshots. This is from an email Constance sent to her sister 4 days before the public announcement. Quote, Beatrice lost the baby. Not surprising at her age. I'll need to manage how this is communicated to avoid embarrassment for Thomas. The room went very still. I continued, reading another message. This is from a group text with 3 other family members, sent 2 days before the announcement. Quote, planning to address Beatrice's situation at the gathering this weekend. The family needs to know so they stop asking awkward questions. I looked up from my phone. These messages show that the public announcement wasn't spontaneous or well-meaning. It was planned, and it violated my explicit request for privacy regarding my own medical information. Several people were staring at Constance now, expressions changing from sympathy to confusion. Someone near the end of the table asked quietly, "Why would you plan something like that?" Constance laughed, but it sounded nervous and thin. "This is taken completely out of context. I was trying to help manage a difficult situation." "Beatrice, you're being too sensitive about this." The word sensitive hung in the air. I'd anticipated it. She always used that word to dismiss concerns. But this time it landed differently. People who'd been nodding along with her earlier now looked uncertain. My sister-in-law, Natalie, spoke up. "I don't think wanting privacy about a miscarriage is being too sensitive." Others murmured agreement. Constance's smile tightened. "I was protecting you from having to explain over and over." "I never asked for that protection," I interrupted gently. "I asked for privacy." Those are different things. The distinction was clear and simple. Even people who wanted to support Constance couldn't quite argue with it. I watched her authority crack, just slightly, like a hairline fracture in glass. She'd always controlled conversations by controlling the narrative. But now, facts were speaking louder than her framing. Natalie took a breath and spoke again. "Mom, you did something similar to me. When I miscarried before having Emma, you announced it at my next baby shower. You've done this to others too." Another cousin spoke up, describing how Constance had shared her divorce details with the church prayer group without permission. Thomas's aunt mentioned medical information Constance had disclosed about her diabetes. One by one, stories emerged around the table. Not angry accusations, but quiet acknowledgments of a pattern. This wasn't a one-off incident or a misunderstanding. This was how Constance operated, finding vulnerable information and making it public under the guise of family care or concern. I watched my husband's face change as he listened. For the first time, he was seeing his mother through other people's eyes instead of through years of learned acceptance. His expression moved from discomfort to something like recognition, then to shame. He defended her automatically, without questioning whether she deserved defending. I spoke again, keeping my tone even. "I'm sharing all this because I want to explain the decision I've made. For my own healing and well-being, I'm stepping back from regular family events for the next several months. This isn't meant as punishment or drama. It's simply what I need to process everything in a healthy way." The announcement was simple and clear. I wasn't demanding anyone else change their relationships with Constance. I wasn't asking people to choose sides. I was just establishing a boundary for myself. Constance's face went pale. She understood immediately what this meant. If I stopped attending gatherings, people would notice. They'd ask why. The narrative would slip further from her control. "That's not necessary," she said quickly. "We can work through this as a family. You don't need to isolate yourself." "I'm not isolating," I corrected. "I'm healing." There's a difference. The distinction again was clear. And this time, I could see it resonating with people around the table. The dinner ended early, conversations stilted and uncomfortable. As people left, several approached me privately with quiet support. "You handled that with real grace," Thomas's uncle told me. "I'm sorry this happened to you." Over the next few days, Constance went into damage control mode. She called family members individually, trying to explain, justify, reframe. I heard about the calls from Natalie, who is now forwarding me screenshots of Constance's messages. "She's calling you ungrateful and vindictive," Natalie reported. "She's saying you ambushed her at a family dinner." But the story kept slipping from Constance's grip. Too many people had witnessed what actually happened. Too many had shared their own experiences. When Constance tried to paint me as the aggressor, people who'd been at the dinner would gently correct the facts. "That's not quite how it went," they'd say. Or, "I was there and Beatrice was actually very calm." For the first time in years, Constance's version of events wasn't automatically accepted as truth. Constance's reputation began shifting in subtle but significant ways. At church, where she'd served on multiple committees, someone verified the facts about what had happened and approached the leadership with concerns about her pattern of boundary violations. One of her charity boards received a quiet complaint about her handling of confidential donor information. Nothing explosive or dramatic, just questions being asked, concerns being raised, verification being sought. The organizations responded professionally, requesting explanations and reviewing protocols. Constance was asked to temporarily step back from 2 positions while things were sorted out. It was presented as voluntary, but everyone understood what it really meant. The woman who'd built her identity on being respected and influential was suddenly facing consequences. Not from me attacking her, but from people simply verifying what was true. Her shield of respectability had been her greatest protection. Now it was crumbling because the foundation had always been built on controlling narratives rather than earning genuine trust. The whispers followed Constance everywhere now. Not the admiring kind she was used to, but questioning ones. At social gatherings, conversations would pause when she entered. People were polite but distant. Her power had rested on being unquestioned. Once questions started, the whole structure became unstable. She lost her position on the church events committee. Her charity board asked her not to attend the next fundraiser. Small social invitations stopped coming. The fall from grace wasn't dramatic. It was a slow erosion of influence and respect. 6 weeks after the dinner, Constance called and asked to meet me privately. Her voice sounded different, smaller somehow. "We need to talk," she said. "Just the 2 of us." I agreed to meet at a neutral coffee shop. Part of me was curious if she'd finally acknowledge what she'd done. The other part knew better than to expect genuine accountability. But I went anyway, prepared for whatever would come. We sat across from each other at a corner table, cups of coffee cooling between us. Constance looked older than I remembered, the careful makeup not quite hiding new lines around her eyes. She cried, real tears this time, not performed ones. "I was trying to protect the family," she said, voice breaking. "People were asking questions about you and Thomas, about why you weren't pregnant yet. I thought if I controlled the information, I could manage how people responded." I listened without interrupting. She continued, "I never meant to hurt you. I just wanted to help. You have to understand, I've always been the one who handles difficult situations for this family." It was the closest she'd come to apologizing, but it still wasn't an apology. She was explaining, justifying, asking me to understand her perspective. She still wouldn't admit wrongdoing. "I appreciate you sharing that," I said calmly. "But managing information about my medical history without my consent isn't protection. It's violation." Her face crumpled. "So that's it? You'll never forgive me." I took a breath and spoke the words I'd been preparing. "You announced my miscarriage to control the narrative in a room full of people. I told the truth about what happened to reclaim my own story. That's the difference between us." My voice stayed even, without cruelty or satisfaction. Just clarity. "I'm not interested in destroying you, Constance. But I'm also not interested in pretending this didn't happen, or that it was somehow acceptable." She stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Her whole life, people had eventually forgiven her, smoothed things over, accepted her version of events for the sake of family peace. She'd counted on me doing the same. "What do you want from me?" she asked finally. "Nothing," I said honestly. "I don't want anything from you. I just want you to understand that there are consequences when you weaponize people's pain." I stood to leave. She reached for my hand, but I stepped back. "I hope you can eventually move past this," I added. "But that's your work to do, not mine." I walked out of the coffee shop feeling lighter than I had in months. The real shift came when Thomas finally made a choice. For weeks after the dinner, he'd been quiet, processing what he'd heard and witnessed. We'd had several difficult conversations where I'd been honest about how his silence had hurt me, how his automatic defense of his mother had made me feel alone in my own marriage. One evening, he came home with a letter he'd written to his mother. He showed it to me before sending it. In clear terms, he acknowledged that he'd failed to protect my privacy, that he'd enabled his mother's behavior through years of non-confrontation, and that moving forward, our marriage required firm boundaries with his extended family. "I'm sending this," he told me. "And I'm copying it to my siblings so everyone knows where we stand." It wasn't dramatic or cruel. It was just honest acknowledgement and clear boundaries. When family gatherings happened over the following months, Thomas stood beside me publicly. If someone made a comment that crossed a line, he addressed it immediately. If his mother tried to manipulate situations, he called it out calmly. He was finally choosing our marriage over his mother's comfort. The family dynamics shifted permanently. Some relationships ended because they'd only ever existed on Constance's terms. Others became real for the first time, built on honesty rather than obligation. Natalie and I grew close, united by shared experiences and mutual support. Thomas's relationship with his mother became more distant but also more honest. She stopped trying to control everything because the tools she'd always used, manipulation, public performance, narrative control, no longer worked. Some family members remained loyal to Constance, viewing me as the troublemaker who disrupted their peaceful dynamic. That hurt, but I accepted it. Peace built on silence about harm isn't real peace. It's just enforced quiet. I went back to therapy, processing the grief I'd been unable to address when it was being used as a weapon against me. I started painting again, something I'd stopped doing years ago without really noticing. I began breathing easier, sleeping better, existing in my own life without constantly bracing for the next violation. For the first time in years, I felt like myself. 8 months after that terrible dinner party announcement, I attended a family gathering for Thomas's cousin's wedding. I walked in feeling calm and grounded, my boundaries clear and my support system solid. Constance was there, sitting at a corner table with a few relatives. She looked smaller, somehow less commanding. No one clustered around her seeking approval or waiting for her pronouncements. She had her coffee, her quiet conversations, but the court she'd held for decades had dissolved. I didn't seek her out, but we made eye contact once across the room. I nodded politely. She nodded back. There was no warmth, but there was also no battle. People approached me throughout the evening with genuine interest in my life, my work, my well-being. Several told me privately that they respected how I'd handled everything. I hadn't destroyed Constance through revenge or cruelty. I'd simply told the truth and refused to disappear into the shame she'd tried to assign me. Justice doesn't always shout or demand attention. Sometimes it just stands tall and speaks clearly, letting facts do the work that anger never could. My miscarriage was still a loss I carried. But it was my loss now, private and processed on my own terms. And that reclamation, that quiet victory of owning my own story, was worth everything.